Assassin's Creed Liberation marks the first game in my Assassin's Creed series retrospective that I'm playing for the first time. I have never played Liberation before, and I was very interested to see how it would stack up to the other games in the franchise, seeing as how it was originally a PlayStation Vita game. I played the remastered version of the game that came bundled with Assassin's Creed 3 Remastered. This is actually the third version of Liberation that's been released, the first one being the original Vita version and the second being AC Liberation HD, which was a remastered version of the game for the 360, PS3, and PC. So Assassin's Creed Liberation Remastered is an upgraded and updated version of the HD version of the game. So it's a remaster of a remaster. Reminds me a little bit of how Shadow of the Colossus got an HD remaster for the PS3 and then ended up being completely remade from the ground up for the PS4. Although Liberation wasn't completely remade for the current gen consoles. Just to be clear. I played Assassin's Creed Liberation on the Xbox One S for one playthrough. This video will contain spoilers, you have been warned. This game looks surprisingly good. When you look back at how the game looked on the Vita compared to this version, it's night and day. Although most of the work for getting the game looking as good as it does definitely seems to have happened the first time it was remastered, as when you compare the Vita version to the HD version, and then compare the HD version to the remastered version, the difference between the HD and remastered version is significantly less than the Vita version and the HD version. You get all that? That's not to say that the remastered version didn't improve the visuals. I can only make observations from videos of the HD version or read what people have said about it because, as I said, I've never played the HD version, but it definitely looks to me like the shadows are more defined and detailed now, the lighting engine has been improved, the reflections on water are better, and I think the character models have been slightly updated. There's still a lot of pop-in, but that's something that's not uncommon with Assassin's Creed games. Honestly, if I didn't know that the game was originally made for a handheld device, I might not have figured it out just from the moment-to-moment gameplay and graphics. It really does look very good. The game runs at a solid 60 frames per second. Just kidding, this is a Ubisoft game. It runs at 30 frames per second. They couldn't even get a Vita game to run at 60 frames per second on the current consoles. At the very least, they should be able to get the next Assassin's Creed game to run at 60 frames per second on the next gen consoles. I mean, Microsoft even said that some games could reach 120 frames per second on the Series X, so there's really no reason for the next gen games to run at 30 frames per The cutscenes are where the game's origins make themselves known. Some cutscenes have the same issues as AC3 where certain sound effects that seemingly should be there like scuffling or grunting aren't, leading them to feel empty and quiet. Cutscenes also have kind of janky animations at times with some less than stellar facial animations and lip syncing. The voice acting as well is pretty hit or miss. Some characters like Evelyn are voiced pretty well while others are not. There's also all kinds of fake accents that mostly suck. Also, for some reason the skip button is always on the screen during cutscenes and there doesn't appear to be a way to remove it. The soundtrack is quite good, mixing the sort of traditional orchestral and electronic elements the franchise has had since AC2 with the sort of deep south African tribal feel with chants and drums. It's a very unique blend and I think it's up to par with the series standard. The game is set in New Orleans, Louisiana in the 1700s. You play as Evelyn de Grandpré, a half African, half French assassin. Evelyn is the first female protagonist in an Assassin's Creed game. It's just a shame that her story is pretty unsatisfying. Evelyn's father, Philippe, is a wealthy businessman who fell in love with one of his slaves, Jean, and ended up having Evelyn with her. Philippe raised Evelyn with all the luxuries he could give her, and Jean was his placée, which apparently means unofficial wife. Philippe eventually married Madeleine de Lille, who became Evelyn's stepmother after Jean disappeared one day while out with Evelyn. Fast forward a number of years and Evelyn is now an assassin trying to eliminate Templar influence in New Orleans. The main problem with the game's story is how it's told. Assassin's Creed as a franchise hasn't always been the most straightforward when it comes to storytelling, employing time skips that cover years and using the databases to flesh out the characters and their backstory ever since AC2. But even compared to previous Assassin's Creed games, Liberation's story is very hard to follow. More than any other game in the franchise that I've played, Liberation felt like we were on a short tour of Evelyn's life, reading the cliff notes rather than experiencing her story. It felt like we were just popping from one event to another without really being shown the connecting tissue between it all. The characters and plot are hard to understand as the game doesn't really explain much about either. Evelyn was trained to be an assassin by her mentor Agate. How did this happen? Well, apparently he rescued her from some people harassing her. Okay, and then what? Did Agate like kidnap her and bring her back to the bayou with him and train her there? Or did he come by her house and somehow convince her to join the Brotherhood? And when did this happen? Because in the nightmare sequence of Evelyn being attacked, she's a pretty young child. So did she sneak off to the bayou for years since she was a kid and no one ever noticed? Or did Agate find her again when she was older? I don't fucking know, the game doesn't explain anything. And even when the game does explain the backstory for certain characters, it doesn't do it in the actual game's story. It does it in the optional database and or Jean's diary pages. There's a whole backstory to Agate that explains how he was sold into slavery and ended up in Haiti, where he met Jean and joined the Brotherhood, only for it to be destroyed, which caused him to escape to New Orleans. But you wouldn't know any of this unless you read it in the database. It feels like there is a whole game that happened before this one that we didn't see. It's not a bad thing for characters to have lots of backstory to them. In fact, it's a pretty good thing. It adds depth. But we have to either experience that backstory ourselves as the player with a flashback, or have it come up in the actual game's story. The developers chose to use the database as the glue that connects the events of the story together, as opposed to being used to explore more of the story. Without the database, we would simply not understand a good chunk of the story. Let's compare Liberation to Red Dead Redemption 2. In Red Dead 2, characters have backstories and reference events that happen that we don't actually get to play in the game, like the boat heist that forced the gang to flee to the mountains that we begin the game on. But the characters actually talk about the past and their past in the story in a way that explains things, like when Arthur talks about his past with Sister Calderon, that gives us more insight into him as a character. This kind of thing just doesn't happen in Liberation. Characters talk about events that happen like we're supposed to know what they're talking about, but we were never actually told what happened or how it happened, so we're left to figure it out ourselves by reading about it in the database. It's hard to get invested in any of the characters or the plot when you don't really understand what the plot is or who the characters are. This is not good storytelling. Liberation basically translated the entire Assassin's Creed gameplay formula to a handheld device. Almost anything you can do in AC3 you can do in this game, be it free running, stealth, or combat. It's really quite impressive that they were able to so accurately replicate the console experience on the Vita. That isn't to say that there aren't problems though, but we'll get to that. Moving around the world and climbing up buildings feels almost as good as it does in other AC games, but there's just a slight feeling of stiffness or rigidness to the camera and movement controls that aren't there in other AC games designed for consoles. The game has 3 main locations that you'll be switching between at various points in the story: New Orleans, Mexico, and the Bayou. Just from a visual perspective, New Orleans and Mexico didn't really do much for me. New Orleans doesn't feel much different from any of the cities in AC3, save for a few buildings that feel very southern plantation-like. But when you're just running around as you do for most AC games, the location just never stood out to me as anything memorable. Same for Chichen Itza in Mexico. It kinda just feels like any number of islands you'd come across while sailing the open seas in Assassin's Creed 4, with the addition of the pyramid from one of the naval missions in AC3. It doesn't help that the maps are much smaller and more linear than in other AC games. Don't get me wrong, I don't need or want open world games to be incredibly massive, as I think we've long since reached the point where there's a little too much open world in our open world games. However, there can also be open worlds that are a little too small, and I think that Liberation fits that bill. This was probably due to the limitation of the Vita, but even so, the actual design of both areas isn't that great. Chichen Itza in particular feels like an afterthought. There are a couple small open spaces in Mexico, but most of the map is made up of linear corridors connecting these small areas together. But the Bayou has none of these problems. The Bayou is one of the most unique and memorable locations in any Assassin's Creed game that I've played. It's visually distinct, with massive trees overgrown with vines and moss, and lots of swamp areas connected by water. I also found traversing the Bayou to be very fun, as the interconnected waterways are perfect for getting around on the rowboat. I used the rowboat in Liberation way more than I used it in any other AC game. Same for the tree running mechanic that was introduced in Assassin's Creed 3. The Bayou seems to have been much more designed around the tree running mechanic than the Frontier ever was. I rarely found it useful or quick to move from tree to tree in AC3, but the mechanic was put to much better use in Liberation, and it was my preferred way to travel around the Bayou. This game is officially where I think I've written off the combat in Assassin's Creed. Combat in Assassin's Creed has never been that deep or great, but it's always been good enough to get the job done. But Liberation Liberation is by far the easiest game in the series so far, and by extension also the least engaging. Combat feels like it's an obstacle that prevents you from continuing on to your next objective, as opposed to an enjoyable part of the game that you look forward to. I basically checked out whenever I entered a combat encounter because there was nothing to keep me engaged. The only times I ever died in the game were because I spaced out during combat encounters because they couldn't hold my attention. Previous games always were incredibly reliant on the counter mechanic, but the lack of difficulty just highlights it even more here. The series needs an overhaul in its combat system, but unfortunately, I know we won't get one for a few more games. Liberation has a few new weapons, but they're basically just reskins of other weapons already present in the franchise. The whip is basically the rope dart, and the umbrella shooter and blowpipe are just the poison darts. The game does add one new mechanic to the combat, however, a mechanic called chain kills. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, wasn't chaining kills together introduced in Brotherhood? Yes it was. So what the fuck am I talking about? Well, you can press the LB button to stop time and enter chain kill mode, where you can select up to 3 enemies and execute them. It's basically the mark and execute mechanic from Splinter Cell Conviction. The animations are incredibly impressive in the way they flow together, but I don't understand the point of it. Like, we can already chain kills together in normal combat, and just like in normal combat, some enemies are immune to the chain kill depending on their weapon. So it's almost exactly like the regular chain kill mechanic. I guess it might have been added because Ubisoft thought it would be harder to chain kills together on the Vita, maybe? I don't really know, but this mechanic, while looking very cool, is redundant and doesn't really add anything to the combat. The most unique feature of the gameplay is the new persona system. No, not like that. Evelyn can choose between 3 different personas, i.e. outfits, that each serve a different purpose. The Lady persona, the Slave persona, and the Assassin persona. The Assassin persona has access to Evelyn's entire arsenal and moveset, but is always at least 1 level of notoriety, meaning it's the most conspicuous outfit and guards take note of you more quickly. The Lady outfit does not allow Evelyn to free run and has a very limited arsenal, but gains notoriety much slower than the other personas, and Evelyn can charm guards and NPCs into either following her or letting her get past them. There are groups of NPCs, however, that will jump Evelyn when she is in this persona, for whatever reason. I found that the Assassin persona was more trouble than it was worth to use for the majority of the game, as trying to run around the city was made very annoying by guards constantly becoming aware of my presence, forcing me to avoid them since I didn't want to be stopped all the time for combat encounters. And the Lady persona is basically useless outside of the missions that you're forced to use it. The Slave persona is what I use for the majority of the game, as it doesn't have a minimum notoriety level and you can free run. It does have a more limited arsenal than the Assassin persona, but honestly that was never really an issue. The persona system is in theory a pretty cool idea, deciding whether it would be best to infiltrate an area as the Lady persona or find a way to free run to where I needed to go during a mission using the Slave or Assassin persona could have led to some missions being more open-ended. But most of the story missions force you to play them as one of the personas, and you can't switch personas mid-mission either, so the experimentation aspect of the system is basically non-existent. I don't understand why you would come up with this interesting idea and then throw it out the goddamn window so thoroughly. Mission design is just as restrictive as AC3's was, meaning it's too restrictive. You need to follow this person at this distance, but you can't kill them until the game says so, and don't lose sight of him or else the game will start counting down like it's your parent threatening to punish you unless you do as they say. The game stands in stark contrast with Ubisoft's other open-world parkour series Watch Dogs, which, while not being a franchise I particularly enjoy, has always allowed the player to approach most missions in whatever way they chose, which is the best part of the Watch Dogs games in my opinion. But Assassin's Creed's idea of mission design is more in line with Rockstar games like Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption, i.e. do what we tell you to, when we tell you to, how we tell you to, or you fail the mission and restart at a checkpoint. However, unlike Rockstar's games, there isn't an engaging story or interesting characters to make up for it. The game had a multiplayer mode on the Vita which has been axed for this remaster. It makes sense, as from what I understand of it, it was designed specifically to take use of some of the features of the Vita. It's probably no great loss that it's not included with the remaster. Liberation has side content like freeing slaves or killing merchants competing with your father's business. I didn't really do the side missions, as I found them incredibly boring just like the rest of the game. There is one interesting idea to be found here year with the inclusion of a side mission called Citizen E. Basically, Liberation is canonically a game made by Abstergo that was sold to the masses using Avelin's life as the story of the game. However, Abstergo, being a Templar organization, either censored, omitted, or tweaked what certain characters said about the Order and its goals in New Orleans. Citizen E is a representation of Avelin's real, unmodified memories, which were brought out by an anti-Abstergo hacker group called Erudito. And once you kill a Citizen E, you gain access to the real conversations and events that happened in some of the cutscenes in the game. Citizen E's are discoverable in the world just by wandering around, so when you find one, kill it. This is a really cool idea. The only bug I encountered in the game was an infinite loading glitch that I didn't record because it was after I had finished the game and I was going back into it to reread some of the database, so I wasn't actually going to be playing it or recording footage. I believe, however, that it was caused by the disc being a little dirty, as I had tried restarting the game first and then the console, but it was only after I had removed the disc and cleaned it that the game finally loaded properly. Still, I can't definitively say it was the disc, as I did restart the Xbox a second time when I was taking out the disc to clean it. Assassin's Creed Liberation is probably the most forgettable entry into the series thus far for me, and I think it will probably remain so going forward. Only one of the 3 areas in the game is interesting to explore and look at. The story is very poorly told, and the gameplay is a stagnation of the AC formula that completely wastes any new ideas it brings to the table. As a result of those 3 main issues, I found the game to be very boring and unengaging. It's not a terrible game, as it still has the bones of a good AC game, but I highly doubt I will ever play this game again. However, taking into account that Liberation was originally a Vita game, it's hard not to respect what the team was able to accomplish with trying to bring a full-fledged Assassin's Creed experience to a handheld. Still, I can say with some certainty that I would probably still have most of the same issues with the game even if I had played it back in the day on the Vita. I'm going to give Assassin's Creed Liberation a 5.5 out of 10. As a package deal, Assassin's Creed 3/Liberation Remastered is actually quite good. I never really considered Liberation to be anything other than a bonus game, so I'm not too disappointed that it's not that great of a game. However, I wouldn't recommend someone buy the remastered version unless they also want to play Assassin's Creed 3. If you liked this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and leaving a comment about what you thought of Liberation. Thanks for watching.